somewhere in your head, the first king of Egypt probably looks like a guy in a golden mask sitting very still while someone fans him with a giant leaf. That's not the beginning. That's the finished product, centuries into the franchise. The actual beginning is messier, muddier, and honestly a lot more interesting, because before there was one Egypt, there wasn't one Egypt at all. There were two. Before there was one Egypt, the Nile Valley was home to different regional powers, with Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north emerging as distinct political and cultural zones. Different pottery styles, different burial customs. Later Egyptian tradition would associate the south with a tall white crown, the Hedjit, and the north with a red one, the Dishret. Two regions, two identities, and at some point, that separation stopped being the norm. So the question isn't really, who was Egypt's first king? It's, how do you get two kingdoms to become one? And who gets to stand at the top when it happens? This is where most people expect a simple story. One king, one battle, one crown, done. Reality, as usual, had other plans. And there's one more thing worth being precise about before we go further. When historians call someone Egypt's first king, they usually mean the first king of the unified Egyptian state, not the first ruler to ever exist anywhere in the Nile Valley. Rulers came before him. What makes this particular king different is what he's credited with finishing. Let's start with what came before the guy everyone credits with unification, because the first king turns out to have had some very ambitious predecessors nobody puts on the poster. By the mid to late 4th millennium BCE, southern Egypt was already changing fast. Archaeologists call this the Naqada culture, named after a site in Upper Egypt, and by its final phase, Naqada III, roughly 3300 to 3100 BC. You start seeing the ingredients of a state: larger settlements, elite burials loaded with imported goods, early administrative markings, and rulers who were clearly more than just respected elders. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was the tail end of a much longer trend across the Nile Valley toward accumulated wealth, controlled land, and leadership that no longer disappeared when the leader did. And then, in 1988, a discovery at Abydos rewrote the timeline. A team from the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, led by Egyptologist Günter Dreyer, excavated a tomb known as Uj in the ancient cemetery of Amelkuayub. Dated to around 3300 BCE, Tomb Uj is the largest predynastic tomb ever found in Egypt. Multiple chambers, roughly 2,000 ceramic vessels, many of them imported from the Levant, along with obsidian bowls and cedar chests brought from abroad, and more than 150 small ivory and bone labels, inscribed with simple glyphs. These are considered among the earliest known examples of writing in Egypt, predating the famous Narmer Palette by roughly 2 centuries. Nobody knows the name of the person buried in Tomb Uj with certainty. The tomb's occupant is often identified with the ruler modern archaeologists call Scorpion Eye, not to be confused with the Hollywood Scorpion King, although that character borrowed its name from real Egyptian archaeology, but that identification is a working label, not a settled fact. What the tomb does show, fairly convincingly, is that decades before the ruler everyone calls Egypt's first king, someone in Upper Egypt already had enough wealth, enough control over long-distance trade, and enough administrative organization to be buried like royalty and inscribed like one too. Some labels found in the tomb reference goods from Lower Egypt, which some researchers interpret as evidence of early trade contact between the two regions, not proof of military conquest. Just proof that the North and South were already talking to each other, one way or another. So unification did not start with a single dramatic battle out of nowhere. It started with generations of accumulating leverage, which brings us to the man history actually remembers, Narmer. Depending on which Egyptologist you ask, he ruled somewhere around 3150 to 3100 BCE, right at the hinge point between the predynastic period and Egypt's first dynasty. And the reason we know his name at all comes down to one object: the Narmer Palette, a 2-foot slab of dark siltstone, carved on both sides, now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, smashing an enemy's skull with a mace while a falcon, representing the god Horus, looms over a captive. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, walking in a victory procession past rows of decapitated enemies. It is, without question, one of the most efficient political advertisements ever carved in stone. One man, both crowns, both lands, message received. Here's where responsible history has to slow down, because the palette is propaganda, and propaganda is not a transcript. Archaeologist Toby Wilkinson and others have pointed out that ceremonial objects like this were designed to project authority, not document a court reporter's version of events. Other objects associated with Narmer, including a year label found at Abydos and various ceremonial artifacts, show that military victory and royal power were recurring, central themes in how he presented himself, which supports the idea that conquest played some real role in his reign. But whether Narmer conquered Lower Egypt in one campaign, finished a process his predecessors had already started, or unification was really a longer, messier, partly diplomatic, partly violent affair stretched across multiple reigns, that's still debated. What we can say with more confidence is this. Whatever the exact sequence of conquest and consolidation, Narmer is the first ruler for whom we have unusually widespread evidence connecting royal authority across both Upper and Lower Egypt. His serek, the symbol marking a king's name, turns up on pottery, seals, and ceremonial objects at sites spanning both regions, at a scale none of his predecessors match. The scale of how, exactly, is the part historians still argue about at conferences. And then there's a separate mystery stacked on top of the first one. Was Narmer even the first king by name, or was that title actually supposed to belong to someone called Menes? Ancient Egyptian tradition, specifically the king lists compiled centuries later in the writings of the Egyptian priest Manetho in the 3rd century BCE, credits a king named Menes as the founder of the unified state in the First Dynasty. For a long time, early Egyptologists assumed Narmer and Menes were two different people. Today, most specialists lean toward a different conclusion, that Menes was likely a later name or title for Narmer himself, essentially two labels for the same man. Not everyone agrees. A minority of scholars have argued the Menes honor should go to Narmer's successor, Horaha, instead. Ancient king lists were part historical record, part political tradition, compiled generations after the fact by scribes with their own political reasons to simplify a messy transition into one clean founding hero. So when you see Menes united Egypt written as fact somewhere, know that you're looking at the neat legend sitting on top of a much rougher archaeological reality, which is, honestly, the pattern with basically every first king story in the ancient world. Power rarely arrives in a single clean moment. It accumulates, through trade, through inherited advantage, through a few generations of rulers, each pushing the boundary a little further. And then one figure gets to stand at the finish line, while history quietly forgets everyone who was running the same race beforehand. Narmer didn't invent Egyptian kingship out of nothing. He was the name attached to the moment the process became undeniable. Scorpion Eye, and whoever came before him, did the unglamorous groundwork that made that moment possible, and got almost none of the credit. Maybe that's the real story behind every first in history. Not a lone genius arriving out of the void, but a long chain of ordinary ambition, until one person happens to be standing there when the door finally opens, and everyone after him agrees to call that the beginning. If you had a guess, who do you think deserves more credit for uniting Egypt? Narmer, or the predynastic rulers before him nobody remembers? Drop your answer in the comments.